Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ross, and I'm the Dean's Professor of History and Director of the Casden Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. It's indeed an honor for me to welcome you all today to our collaborative memorial tribute in partnership with Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion for our dear friend and colleague Sharon Gillerman, Professor of Jewish History at USC and HUC. And it's with a heavy heart that we remember the enduring legacy of Sharon, who passed away on November 20th, 2020. Sharon was a teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend to so many of us, and we remember her for her thoughtfulness, empathy, and devotion to both the intellectual, personal, and cultural growth of her students, and we remember her for her important scholarly contributions to Jewish history. We're honored to have counted Sharon as a pioneer of the relationship between HUC and USC, and her devotion to both institutions made her an invaluable founding member of the Casden Faculty Advisory Board. Today, we're going to hear from several of Sharon's closest colleagues from USC and HUC, who will share their perspective on how Sharon touched their lives with her depth, rich intellect, and enduring loyalty. Our event will be moderated by Dr. Sarah Bunin-Benor, Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies at HUC and a longtime friend and colleague of Sharon's. We're also privileged to welcome Mark Quigley, Sharon's husband, who will respond to each panelist's unique story with his own perspective and insight. Our thoughts and prayers are with Mark and their daughter Maya, as we all continue to navigate the difficult road of living in the wake of Sharon's legacy while striving to preserve her memory in meaningful and lasting ways. At this point, I call on Sarah Benor to begin today's event by introducing each panelist and facilitating the power of memory and reflection in Sharon's honor. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you so much to the Casden Institute and to HUC for co-sponsoring this event. The order of events today is that several people will give reflections, and then Sharon's husband, Mark Quigley, will respond afterwards. The order is me, Joshua Holo, Leah Hochman, Paul Lerner, Stephen Smith, and Brie Lascota. And I'll be introducing each of them as they come on. So my remarks have to do with the impact that she had on me and how I continue to think about her and the many ways that she was part of my life since she has died. The last time I spoke to Sharon was November 3rd, election night. I texted her, I just discovered Rodrigo y Gabriela, an awesome guitar duo, and found them a good distraction from worrying about the election. I thought you might like them too, and I sent a link. This was part of a series of texts that I sent her when she was in the hospital with music and fun facts, like various ways to say refuah shlema, a speedy recovery in Judeo-Italian. Usually she didn't have the time or energy to respond, but sometimes she did. And it was always really special to me when I did get a response. And this time she responded that she had actually seen Rodrigo y Gabriela open for Paul Simon at the Greek Theater. And this led to an exchange of texts and a phone call as we were both watching the election results come in. First, we spoke about her health, her treatment, and her discomfort. Then we talked about the election. Finally, the conversation turned to work, and I told her about a debate I tried to do in my Intro to Judaism class about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, about the election. Finally, the conversation turned to work, and I told her about a debate I tried to do in my Intro to Judaism class about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and I felt it didn't quite serve its pedagogical purposes, and I told Sharon I'd love to get her advice on that in the future. Of course, she said sure, she'd be happy to. But sadly, I was never able to get that advice from her. And since then, there have been many times that I've wanted to talk to Sharon, and I want to share some of these with you to demonstrate what a strong impact she had on me as a colleague and a friend in so many domains. So first, in Jewish studies, She and I were both involved in leadership roles in the Association for Jewish Studies, and I wished I could have asked her what she thought of the online conference. Then just a few days ago, I ran a panel on the relationship between Jewish studies and ethnic studies. And as I was preparing for that panel, I thought a lot about Sharon, about a panel that she was on a few years ago about Nazi concentration camps and American internment camps. And I so wanted to talk about the ethnic studies debates with her. Another domain was her research. Randomly, a few weeks ago in JTA, an article appeared about Breitbart. And I really wanted to hear what Sharon thought of that article. And also, I just edited a book review for the Journal of Jewish Languages about language in Germany that I think she would have really been interested in. Another domain was my own research. I revised a draft of an article that I had gotten her advice on about a year ago for us in a section in that article about German anti-Semites, and she is thanked in the acknowledgements of that article. Another issue is faculty business. I took over her role as faculty chair and as a member of the Executive Committee on Academic and Student Affairs at HUC. And of course, I desperately wanted her advice on all of that. Another domain is politics. I never got to celebrate with Sharon when the election results were finally finalized, or when the Georgia senatorial election results came in, or when Biden was inaugurated. And I know she really would have loved the Amanda Gorman poem at inauguration. Also, Jewish holidays, making Hamantaschen, which we had done a few times together in the past. Ikar's really fun plans for operating during a pandemic, and so much more. Now, of course, all of these were sad moments for me, reminders that Sharon is gone. But they also show that Sharon's memory lives on. They show how important she was to me. And of course, I'm not the only one experiencing moments like these. Her colleagues, friends, and relatives all experience moments like these all the time. And of course, Mark, Maya, David, and Roberta experience moments like these all the time. The continuing presence of Sharon Gillerman, Bracha Malka, in our lives shows the blessing that she brought to the world and the blessing she continues to bring. Zichrona livracha. Now I'm going to introduce Joshua Holo. Joshua is the Associate Professor of Jewish History and Dean of the Skirball campus of HUC, in both capacities of which he worked with Sharon, as a faculty colleague and as members of the campus leadership team. Josh?
Thank you, Sarah. And I'd like to begin my thank yous with thanking Mark Quigley, our friend, our colleague, and in this difficult situation, our friend who so generously shared your heart with us in joining you in grieving the loss of Sharon among us. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors on the Hebrew Union College side, led by Sarah Benor and Leah Hochman, and on the Casden Institute side by Stephen Ross and Lisa Ansel. And I'm honored, of course, to speak side by side on this panel with our friends and colleagues, Paul Lerner, Stephen Smith, and Brila Skoda. I take the time to offer these thanks, not only because they come from the heart, but also because they represent a constellation of relationships. Indeed, a constellation that represents Sharon's career as a bridge across our institutions and as a person who was capable of multiplying relationships. And in the paradoxical math of the human condition, this multiplication of relationships simultaneously lightens the burden of our grief at her loss and increases our capacity to celebrate her life. And Sharon served as another kind of bridge at the same time, which I would like to speak about for a moment, which is a bridge between the rigorous, sometimes cold study of history and its application to our world in real time. In her purely academic guise as an historian, Sharon pursued a career of clear-eyed assessment of humanity's darkest hour, the Holocaust, and early 20th century European Judaism. As a scholar and as a teacher, she tested our assumptions in the classical historical way of rigorous study by looking at the sources and evaluating them with a clear eye and an honest assessment. This was part of her role on the purely academic side. But as I said, she bridged this capacity to assess critically with another side of history, and indeed another role for history in our society. And she executed this other side of the historian's craft most prominently as a professor of our rabbinical students. She effectively hopped the fence a bit, or as it were in our situation, she crossed Jefferson Boulevard. In this process, she didn't so much soften her rigor as she did translate it for a different population. I recently, just a few days ago, had such a revealing conversation with a rabbinical student who paused our conversation about completely unrelated topics, but knowing that this event was coming up and knowing my feelings about Sharon, he simply wanted to mourn her loss as a student. And he said, I remember her pushing me so hard to understand the Holocaust in ways that I simply hadn't been ready to do before. And yet she was there for him to push him, and at the same time to sit by him and kind of go through it with him, understanding that he hadn't been an historian as an undergrad. And as a rabbinical student, he nevertheless was responsible to carry history forward in a meaningful and responsible way. But he had to get there. And she was willing to take him on that journey in a way which, though based in history, was in fact also redolent of the human work of teaching. You see, our students on the rabbinical side of the street, they need to understand the undergirding of analytical history, but Sharon knew that they were going to do something very specific with it. They were not going to write articles and books. They were going to convey it emotively. They were going to translate it from the pulpit and in the classroom. They were going to communicate it to people, our educators and rabbis, for whom this history lives. This history contributes to their identity and sense of self. And indeed, the history that these future rabbis and educators, students of Sharon, would be teaching and communicating, would shape choices in the real world that these congregants and students would make. Sharon could achieve this double act of pure academic rigor and applied history because both of them were integral to her personality. Smart, committed, and relentlessly honest. Sharon, in other words, brought history to life on the page, in the classroom, and in our communities. And for that, we have much to celebrate indeed.
Thank you, Josh. And I just love that image of Sharon as a bridge builder and a translator. Next, we have Leah Hochman. Leah Hochman is director of the HUC Lockheim School for Judaic Studies and associate professor of Jewish thought at USC. She worked with Sharon in many capacities at HUC and USC. Leah?
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to the Casden Institute and to Steve and Lisa in particular for their deep commitment to making sure that Sharon is remembered and honored and that her legacy continued. Thanks to Mark for being so gracious about letting us revel in our memories and thoughts about Sharon. And thanks, of course, to all the panelists for being here with me today. I want to celebrate Sharon's teaching and really her impact on her students. I had the occasion to look through her course evaluations, and I was struck by how careful Sharon was both in her course design and in her deep commitment to the students' own experience of learning, which is what came up time and time again over the last decade. I want to begin with what I think frames virtually all of the comments from her USC students. In answer to the question, what about this course has been most successful? One student wrote simply, Sharon Gillerman, the one and only. But the comment continued. The presentation of certain concepts as debatable and opening up that debate to students. This demonstrates a validation of student input that not all professors allow for, but I think is incredibly helpful in engaging with the material. I also think it is a really useful way of guiding students. The course material is very well laid out, and all of the objectives are very clearly addressed by lectures and by reading. I also think that being able to confront primary sources, which should often be questioned and not taken at face value, is not only essential to the nature of the course, but it is also essential to developing skills of critical reasoning and analysis, skills which I think are absolutely essential to develop. What I love about this comment, besides its length, and I will just preface this by saying it echoes so many other student evaluations that I've spent the last week reading, is that it illustrates how Sharon was able to elicit student participation in individual, in specific, in unique ways, and her ability to truly open the sort of blossoming of awareness of the sources and their various viewpoints for which we all strive. Another student wrote, I loved how this professor lectured. I was always engaged with the course material and felt like she was almost telling a story rather than just reciting information off a PowerPoint. I enjoyed coming to class and leaving with something new. And that speaks to another aspect of Sharon's teaching, which I have realized really gets at the core of who she is and what she has gifted us. The holding of story, of real story, not of metaphor or of symbolism, but the strength and the courage and the integrity of each person's story and how they tell it. I think history for Sharon was the sense of a collection of individuals who together shared experience. And her careful untangling of the different ways in which that experience was lived and was recorded and was subsequently shared and then used or utilized, and then unpacking all of those layers. That is her great legacy, giving each of those perspectives individual power, and then giving those of us learning about those perspectives our own power of judgment. Sharon empowered learning. A couple of other voices, and then I'll end. The lectures were so valuable, and the professors painted such great pictures of the history and tightened concepts together flawlessly. Amazing lectures. The whole course opened my eyes to more perspectives on a very large topic and staying in the history of humanity. Here's the one I think she probably would have liked the best. I learned about the differences between primary and secondary resources and how to apply knowledge toward understanding the context. Sharon's impact was not just at the undergraduate level. Her graduate students filled my inbox with praises of her careful use of source material and the depths of her willingness to question and to think and to look at multiple sides of Jewish history. She was a consummate teacher. And I really echo the sentiment of the student who wrote, I wish there was another course available about the Holocaust with Professor Gillerman. Personally, I miss Sharon's good counsel, her collegiality, her role in administrative affairs, and her willingness to lead the faculty to places they didn't know they wanted to go. It's a goal of mine to get evals like hers, but also to be open to the world of story as she was. Her legacy in her teaching is that many of her students want to continue in their study of the Holocaust and go on to graduate school, or to go on to teaching roles and using the resources that she opened their eyes to in new and various ways, and being mindful of the way that they are also contributing resources themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And I know that we all wish we could have been in the classroom with Sharon. That's something that we as professors often don't get, is the experience of being a student in our colleagues' classrooms. And I turn it now over to Paul Lerner. Paul is a professor of history at USC and director of the Max Kade Institute for Austrian German Swiss Studies, and a longtime friend and co-author of Sharon's.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me also thank the Casden Institute in particular Steve Ross and Lisa Ansell, and everybody else on this panel for making this happen today. And I'll come to Mark a little bit later, so I'm going to leave him out of these initial thank yous. In this often very isolating and demanding occupation, I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have had a colleague like Sharon, with whom I shared uncannily similar and complementary research and teaching interests. But upon further reflection, it might not have been so uncanny after all, because I suspect there was some mutual influence, or at least Sharon and our long association may have influenced me in the directions that my research came to take as we discussed our work and found ourselves in environments where we worked together increasingly over the 20+ years of our friendship. Quite some time ago, both of us struggling to conceptualize our sprawling and inchoate book projects, mine on German department stores, hers on Breitbart, the German Jewish strongman, Sharon and I made a plan to meet regularly and discuss our work with the goal of getting both of our manuscripts closer to coherence and completion. I recall only 2 meetings over successive summers at a West Side cafe after seemingly endless postponements due to travel schedules, illnesses, parenting emergencies, etc. But what I remember most of all is how attentively Sharon listened and how brilliantly she grasped what I was groping for and how useful her feedback was and critique was. My book's eventual title, The Consuming Temple, came directly, and I never actually told her this, but it came directly out of one of those meetings. And each time I was able to share my work with Sharon in whatever format, however formally or informally, public or private, I came away inspired, excited, and energized to return to the desk and keep moving forward. Our collaboration was remarkable and rare. And when I think back over the totality of it, I'm struck by the miles we logged together and the communities we shared, and by the devastating loss not only of Sharon, whom we're here to commemorate, of course, but of other mutually cherished colleagues and friends, Jonathan Hess, to name one, and most recently, Steve Lowenstein, whom several of us, including Sharon, gathered to celebrate in October 2019, just months before his death. Thinking back over the years, memories of Sharon's wit and humor flash and flicker by, cracking irreverent jokes at early Shoah Off Foundation events. My apologies, Stephen, but this is before you were there. Feeling self-conscious and paraded publicly at staged German-Jewish reconciliation programming, being shushed by Italian reporters as Sharon, Jim Lichty, and I mocked Werner Herzog's pomposity at the Hollywood premiere of Invincible, the film based on the life of Sigmund Breitbart. And my apologies to Gary Bart, who I think is with us today. I mean no disrespect to Gary or to the achievement of the film, only to the behavior of his director. I also remember the conference circuit and the road trips to AJS's, German Studies Associations in San Diego, and an AHA, American Historical Association in San Francisco, exploring Southern California through the regional German studies meetings that we started along with our colleague and friend Ann Goldberg, from Irvine to Riverside and all points in between, and many other campuses, and also the low-key time spent together, Jewish holidays, German movie nights with Jim and Tamara Zwick, and various Villa Aurora fellows, the working groups we formed and joined on gender in German Jewish history with Ben Botter, where we tried this kind of experiment of foregrounding gender and in particular masculinity as a prism with which to see not only recent, but really the longer durée of German history, which culminated in our book on German Jewish masculinities that the 3 of us edited. Similarly, the group on German Jewish popular culture with Jonathan Hess, Jonathan Skolnick, Lisa Silverman, and several others, which met in Los Angeles, Washington, Graz, and Jerusalem over a 6-year span, and which tried to get beyond just the famous leading figures in German Jewish thought and high culture and look at daily life and practice and popular culture beyond that level. The last thing I want to mention is the task of completing Sharon's essay on the Jews of the Weimar Republic for Oxford's Weimar Republic Handbook, which led to an extremely rewarding collaboration with Mark, whose beautiful prose and editorial acumen carried the chapter through to completion. The vision of German Jewish history that Sharon presents in this chapter is of a community that embraced multiple identities, a dynamic, searching, experimenting, boundary-crossing population. I began to appreciate why this subject, German Jewish history, was so close to Sharon's heart, how where others had seen decay and deracination, had seen assimilation and stodginess, Sharon rather saw strength, resilience, depth, and creativity, qualities and values she embodied in her scholarship and in her friendships. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And one image from what you said that is sticking with me is how energizing it was to have conversations with Sharon about your work and her work, and you know, you come away from those conversations just more excited about the work. Next, we have Stephen D. Smith. Stephen is Finchie Viterbi Executive Director Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation, and he is the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education. He worked with Sharon on a number of projects and programs.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to say to you both, Mark and Maya, just how sorry we are to be here sharing this moment with you, but also how delighted we are to share in the life and the joy that Sharon brought to all of those who are around her, for which, of course, I can imagine how much you miss her, as do we all. Because in fact, Sharon, for me, was about quiet influence. You know, she was no fuss, she was no drama, she was just always there. I remember arriving at USC at the Shoah Foundation in my first month or two. Sharon was in the building. I didn't know whether she was a member of the staff or a visitor. She was just sitting there talking to somebody. And I remember finding out that she worked at HUC. And I said, HUC, what is HUC? And before I knew it, between her and Leah Hochman, they became my guides to the other side of Jefferson, and taught me about that wonderful relationship that we share, which of course she was so adept at navigating between our institutions. Leah was talking a moment ago about the influence that she had on students, and as she, you know, taught the Holocaust, which of course was close to all of us at the Shoah Foundation. I watched with wonder as she packed out those classrooms semester after semester with students eager to learn from her. I have to tell you, I don't go to rate my professor for obvious reasons, but I did just to figure out what students were thinking. And actually her tags are: get ready to read, amazing lectures, skip class, you won't pass, respected. And I think that was, for me, that word respected is what I experienced at USC Shoah Foundation. You see, she wasn't a visitor to the Shoah Foundation. A lot of people call ahead and say, hi, you know, I need a meeting with you, or I need a meeting with your colleagues. I would just walk in and she would be sitting there, maybe with Karen Youngblood, maybe with Crispin Brooks, maybe with Wolf Gruner, a whole number of our colleagues that would work with her. And of course, I thought I was the only one privileged to work with her, but that was not the case, because I would walk in and there she would be in a room with one of my colleagues working on some program or some plan. And so she was a part of our family, actually. It would just be, hi, Sharon, what are you doing today? And she would tell me about something she was working on with somebody. That quiet influence was understated, but very influential. We have a group called the Faculty Advisory Council, and Sharon would come and attend that. And very often she wouldn't say too much, but when she did, you had to be ready for it, because it would get right to the heart of the matter, ask the question that would be the killer punch that would actually change the course of the conversation, because she had that very understated way of working out what the real problem was that we were trying to solve. It was only actually on her passing that I really learned her influence behind the Shoah Foundation, because of course I talked to our colleagues, what were you doing, Sharon, in that room all the time? That you were talking about something. Oh, we were working on this program, or we were working on an indexing project. And I learned that, in fact, it was when Sharon was a PhD student, when she was doing a PhD with Shaw Friedlander, that she would come down to the Universal Lot, and she was the first historian to use the Shoah Foundation's archive, and that she had a very heavy influence on the way in which the Shoah Foundation transpired. For those of you who don't know, there are 6,000 almost now testimonies in the Shoah Foundation's archive. And each one of those archives is built on something called a pre-interview questionnaire. It's where we sit with the witness or the survivor of the Holocaust, and we talk to them about their life before we go to interview them. What I learned from my colleague, Karen Youngblood, is that Sharon Gillerman was one of the architects of that document that's been used 56,000 times to ensure that those lives could tell their stories. What I also learned from Karen Youngblood and my colleague Crispin Brooks, who were trying to work out how do we index all of these stories and make sure that they can be used for teaching around the world for time to come, that Sharon too was one of the architects of our indexing system that we've been using now for over 20 years. And so that quiet influence was always there. They described her as one of the team, one of the people that made what we do actually possible. I wish I'd had a chance to thank her for that. I came later to the Shoah Foundation. I didn't know that she had put those hours into helping working out what we would one day become. When we were thinking of moving to USC, one of the questions that was raised was, so who is going to use this archive in the future? And it was Karen Youngblood who said, this is not about us, those who collect the testimony. It's about those who use it, who will teach with it, who will tell the world from it what it really means. I learned from her, she was referring to the mentorship that Sharon Gillerman had given her about what its real purpose was going to be for the future. In talking with my colleague Crispin Brooks, he mentioned to me that he had the privilege of working with Sharon when she was teaching a Holocaust course, and he would go in a couple of times a year and speak about his work in the Ukraine. And he sent me a note, and I just want to read this to you as I bring my remarks to a close. He said, you know, we usually went for coffee afterwards, always fascinating discussions about life and identity, research, and the Shoah Foundation. Learning that she had died really hit me hard. I'm still angry at the universe about this. It's not just the shock, it's that she was an incredibly thoughtful, sensitive, truly good person, and in her prime. Way too young, way too sad. What Crispin shared with me struck a chord with me because I realized that she had had all of these relationships all around me all that time, including the one that I shared with her, which we all treasure. And I just know that now that she's gone, but nevertheless, she'll always be there, that quiet influence that we have lost in person, but will be there in the work that we do for years to come. May her memory always be for a blessing.
Thank you, Stephen. And it is really amazing how much influence she had in so many domains of scholarship and just life. I mean, that I was really struck by that during the funeral and the Shiva, at how many friends and relatives didn't know about each other because they had all been influenced by Sharon and loved Sharon, and now this was the first time that they were really coming together. And I mean, it's really sad that was the opportunity for them to meet and find out how much influence she had on so many people. Next is Bree Lascota. Bree first met Sharon in spring 1999, early in Sharon's career teaching at USC. And at that point, Bree was Sharon's grad student. Then after that, she was Sharon's grad student at HUC, where she was also the faculty assistant. And later, Bree became Sharon's TA for 10 sections of JS 211G, the Holocaust course at USC, and also her research assistant. She was also Sharon's friend and neighbor. In fact, she tried on her wedding dress for the first time at Sharon's house. Bree.
Thank you. Oh, all of that is so hard to follow and take in. What I want to talk about with Sharon is how she could tell the truth. Sharon could give you everything you needed to know in one sentence. And it wasn't so much quippy one-liners, though she had those. And if you got one, they stung. It was the truth, simply told powerfully. And it was exactly what I always needed to hear. As Sarah said, I met Sharon my last semester of USC when I was an undergrad. And then in this very strange twist of fate, I got my first full-time job as the faculty assistant at HUC, where I was the only non-Jew pursuing a degree. And it wasn't an easy transition for me. The work part was fine, but being the only person who was not like everyone else was really new for me. And it revealed so many layers and assumptions and misunderstandings that I didn't even know were there. One day I was sorting through files on the floor in her office, helping her get organized, and I talked with Sharon about it. I was venting and she was listening. And then in this 3-sentence exchange, she set me straight. She said, "It sounds like you're struggling with being the only non-Jew here." Yes, I had said, sort of hesitant and sheepishly. And she said, "You're really going to need to work on that." And she was right. It was really simple. She was so clear and she was so to the point, so utterly honest. It was the truth told boldly without any room for misunderstanding. There was no edge. There was no judgment. What she offered as a mentor was clarity. She could get to the point as if words and time were a precious resource, not to be wasted or thrown around casually. It wasn't just that she offered this, though, as a correction. She walked with me as she showed me what it meant to be in the Jewish community from the inside, not as an outsider. She wanted me to experience it in its richness and its complications so I could understand it. The first Orthodox synagogue I ever visited was with her. We both drove there separately, and when I asked if that was okay, she was so unbothered by it that I found it refreshing and honest, as if to say I'm doing what makes sense given the circumstances, and it's fine. I became a regular at her Shabbat table, sometimes coming early just to hang out, mostly watching her masterfully prep in the kitchen and understand what it meant to her to welcome the Sabbath together. Later in life, both mothers to young children, she'd invite us to the most kid-centric, joyful seders. Judaism and sharing it brought her a tremendous amount of joy. When I went to Hebrew University, she offered me everything I needed to know about living in Jerusalem. The best cafe where I should study. It had overstuffed chairs tucked in books and stone archways and the best hot chocolate. It was through an alley, up a set of stairs at the end of Ben Yehuda Street. I should make time to go to Beit Tiso for a cheap glass of wine and jazz in the garden. She made sure I had to go to Yikar and experience Carl Buck singing, which she promised would be like any other synagogue she had taken me to. When I went to Berlin, she made me promise that I would stay in Mitte, and she even passed me the names of a few nightclubs to go to. She glided effortlessly through these different worlds and even different countries. I was one of her TAs for JS 211, the Holocaust class, and she cared about how students understanding what occurred, but more importantly, she cared about how they thought about what happened. And she cared to teach them the practice and what the profession of history grapples with as central questions. She structured the major paper for this class, having students pick to write about the scholarly debate, like on a topic, something like how gender functioned in concentration camp experience, or the role of anti-Semitism as a motivation for Nazi actions, or how and when Nazis planned their murderous campaign. What she was doing in this was assigning students the understanding of how historians do their work. She was making these students engage in the world of scholarship by having them take seriously the different arguments and evidence that scholars use to arrive at their conclusions. She wanted them to erode conventional wisdom and the lure of quick and easy answers and replace it with rigorously architected, structured thinking and analysis. She was a deeply committed teacher, having been a school teacher, which prepared her well for teaching college. I remember her leading a teacher training late into the evening for facing history on ourselves in the multi-purpose room at HUC after teaching her USC and her HUC courses. Spurred by her example, I knew that I could take a job teaching in an Orthodox Persian Jewish girls' day school for 2 years. Sharon had offered me guidance as I navigated that world, so she had prepared me well for it with her mentoring. One day, one of my students showed me a picture with her getting a big hug from Bradley Cooper, a movie star she had met on the street nearby. And I said, "Oh, my dear, I thought you were Shomer Negia." And she said, "Yeah, but not for celebrities." I called Sharon as soon as class let out, and we laughed at the layers and contradictions of religious life. She had a wicked sense of humor. Sharon lived her life as a teacher, an educator, someone who believed in investing in people so that their thinking could be crisper and richer, more nuanced, closer to what was true. I remain forever grateful, shaped and formed by her example, her corrections, the brilliance and steadfastness of her own mind. May these and all our memories of her be a blessing.
Wow, Bree, thank you. And it just reminds me of during one of the Shiva sessions that a student stayed up until 3 in the morning in, I think, Hungary she was located in, because Sharon had had such an impact on her in the short mentorship she provided. So the fact that you worked with her as a mentee and a student and a colleague and a friend in so many ways, I mean, we can only guess how much of an impact she had on you. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mark Quigley. Mark was Sharon's partner for the past 19 years, during which they collaborated on many projects, large and small. Mark describes Sharon as his most enthusiastic and gifted teacher of all aspects of Jewish culture, history, language, music, spirituality, holidays, and life. Mark is an associate professor of English, specializing in Irish literature and culture at the University of Oregon, where he will soon be one of the newest faculty contributors to the Judaic Studies curriculum, teaching a class developed in collaboration with Sharon last fall.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm so grateful to Lisa Ansel and to Steve Ross and their work with the Casden Institute for organizing this event. And I've only been able to attend a few Casden events before, but I've heard accounts of so many of them in great detail from Sharon over the years that I feel I should almost get credit for completing the major in Jewish studies at USC, or at least a minor. And that's something I hope to talk with Leah about later on, since I have her ear today. But it is certainly true that the Casden Institute and its talks and events have been part of the buzz and rhythm of my household for many years. And more than that, the intellectual and cultural life of Casden have been intertwined with my own very different intellectual life in Irish studies and reflections on race, empire, and post-coloniality. I remember how I'd often have ideas sparked after talking with Sharon about the exchanges and ideas at Casden events. But for all that, I never imagined I would find myself speaking at a Casden event. And I'm truly humbled by the generosity of the invitation. I'm equally humbled to be part of a panel with Sarah, Bree, Josh, Leah, Stephen, and Paul. And I really appreciate all your reflections and all the thought, effort, and love you've invested to make this such a special event. I'm also grateful for all of you who are joining us today from so many different places. It's so wonderful to have that sense of community that Sharon helped to weave, shows such durability and vitality and capacity to generate new ideas and conversation. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I understand Sharon as a thinker and a teacher and a person. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how Sharon has shaped me as an intellectual. But I'd like to begin with a small confession that I think would likely mortify, delight, move, and seem patently obvious to Sharon in roughly equal measures. It's been an especially challenging week for me, with some urgent and really difficult family matters emerging unexpectedly and consuming almost all of my time. And all along in the back of my mind, I've been conscious of how few days remain before our gathering today, and wondering how I could possibly find the time and space to string together some ideas and some words. It was also a week, as Paul mentioned, where he and I were rushing to finish editing a chapter on Jewish Weimar that Sharon wrote for a forthcoming Oxford volume, and a week when I had to deal with the contentious committee I'm on at my university. I'm sure you don't have those at HUC or USC, but occasionally that happens at Oregon. So I was really feeling the weight of all of that and thinking about what I might say this afternoon as I was leaving a visit with Sharon's mother to rush home to bring Maya to soccer practice and then take our energetic shepherd on a sufficiently long walk while contemplating what new atrocity I might commit in the kitchen. And as I was thinking about how to juggle that and how I might possibly find space to reflect on Sharon as an intellectual and a teacher, it occurred to me that the intellectual and the writing task I had before me was entirely embedded in the routine and urgent and demanding tasks of daily and family life I was trying to navigate. In making that observation, I want to call attention to a few things that are at once patently obvious, particularly to Sharon, but still often are avoided in academia. Most and probably all of us have complicated pressures and obligations to navigate as we do our intellectual work and teach and give talks, etc. But we're not supposed to talk about it. Who wants to hear about it? And still more, we want to see the seeming effortlessness and polish of academic presentation. So do I. It's nice to see, it's elegant, etc. It's fine. And that's what Sharon delivered so consistently in the classroom at USC and HUC and at conferences and symposia and even indeed at many Casden events. But what occurred to me as I drove home from the other night was that Sharon not only lived the life of family and community devotion so intensely and so committedly, while still being so engaged and illuminating as a scholar and a teacher, Sharon was also smart enough to realize how much there is to be learned from attending to those details of daily living and loving and struggle and loss. This is especially true for the historian like Sharon, who wants to understand the concerns, the aspirations, the ideas animating people in a particular time and place that are neither represented by the prominent discourses of their own era, nor by the historiography that is sedimented over them. This is kind of more of an academic talk in some fashion, or anyway, bear with me. Both accounts shape consciously and unconsciously how we might deeply encounter or entirely overlook particular people, groups, or concerns. And for Sharon, she had an especially keen appreciation for this. She saw how the seemingly mundane and decentered could inform her work as a social historian and a gender historian in terms of the questions it prompted her to ask and the types of archival materials or other data she might use to bring light to new understandings of Jewish and German life and experience. But much more than that, Sharon's remarkable sensitivity to and honoring of the importance of those daily and surprising struggles informed how she interacted with her students and her colleagues. She understood in a really profound way that everyone she encountered had their ongoing struggles and victories and rhythms, and she opened herself to them out of compassion and solidarity and just deep interest. She knew that that was the best way to go through life. And she also knew in a way that I think few are attuned to, that there was much to be learned there for her reflections on both the present and the past. That attention and presence made a deep impression on so many others who have spoken at memorials for Sharon over the past few months. And I could give many examples, but some of them were already mentioned. But even as that generosity and warmth so defined Sharon, I think it is important to linger there a bit, to be sure we might understand and indeed confront what this meant in its fullness, especially in the context of our grief over her loss. Memories of Sharon's attentiveness to the details of daily living and struggle can be potentially misleading, I would say. It is tempting to wallow in these memories of attentiveness and the depths of compassion Sharon brought to so many of us. Believe me, I understand the temptation and even the necessity at times of doing that wallowing, to feel surrounded by her attentive presence once again. But I think that would be to seriously underestimate Sharon, and ironically, to underestimate ourselves. It lets ourselves off the hook too easily. To try to explain what I mean by that, I want to share with you the profound dilemma that I faced with planning Sharon's funeral, and how reflecting on Sharon's wisdom helped me to figure out an approach. The most basic way to explain the problem as I saw it was that it was difficult to speak both to Sharon as an intellectual scholar and teacher, and to Sharon as a person and presence in people's lives, and in a series of communities around the world. Each risked overshadowing the other. So it seemed to me clear fairly quickly that there had to be at least two distinct talks reflecting on those different aspects of her life, so we could give each a bit of room to breathe. But a new problem was potentially created by that division. For more than any other academic I know, who Sharon was as a person in the world was inseparable from who she was as an intellectual. That was not as much a problem for the Sharon as a person talk, but it was much more of a challenge for the talk about Sharon as an intellectual and teacher. The challenge, it seemed to me, stemmed from the conventions of how we tend to talk about academic life, and more fundamentally, how we tend to conduct academic life. Essentially, I would suggest it reflects a collective failure of imagination of what academic life can and should be. But it was a failure that Sharon did not share. That's what made it such a challenge. To list all of Sharon's areas of intellectual expertise and intervention as a teacher and scholar would not only amount to a huge recitation, it would be quite literally beside the point. To try to offer an intellectual biography and overview of contributions, as is a familiar convention, would likewise be more of an inventory or a scaffold, lacking the spirit or indeed ruha. I had to practice before, but Sharon would be amused at my terrible Hebrew, as is common. But the ruha that was the most important and memorable part of Sharon's intellectual and teaching life, and Sharon more generally. There simply aren't great examples of how to think and talk about that in an academic discourse. That's why I was so grateful for Carol Bakos for her willingness to step into that imaginative half-light and find such an insightful and eloquent means to convey the kind of thinker, teacher, and scholar that Sharon was and the example she offered us. Notably, Carol's approach to developing her tribute was one grounded in the social, in weaving together different voices and conversations and impressions, and in capturing the experiences of colleagues who knew Sharon as one who they shared all aspects of their lives and struggles and successes with. For what defined Sharon as a thinker, far more than her stunning intellectual range and erudition, more even than her enthusiasm, but linked with it, was her commitment to intellectual life as an irreducibly social enterprise. Those of you who are academics or writers or artists may laugh ruefully at that idea, as you know, as I do, how incredibly lonely intellectual work can be, as you have to isolate yourself to be able to research and concentrate and distill and write. And Sharon certainly felt that too. At home, we would borrow from Mel Brooks, she would borrow from Mel Brooks' Get Smart TV show and declare a cone of silence around her so that she could focus on her notes and her writing. But even though that was a necessary part of Sharon's intellectual life and production, it wasn't its true source. Its true source was social in at least two key senses. One, being produced in collaboration with others, and two, being focused on the concerns of social history, on the struggles of daily living. As a social historian and as a gender historian, Sharon understood almost innately that those struggles are at once significant in and of themselves, and they can also be traced outwards to illuminate profiles and ramifications that produce very different accounts of groups or problems or moments that lead us to look at people and concerns that have been ignored. Sharon's sense of academic life as collaborative and social meant that it emerged from discussion and listening, really listening, which is a lot more rare than we would often like to admit. Indeed, if we are to be honest, real listening is almost structurally disabled in academia. As Sharon's colleague in Jewish and gender history, Darcy Burkle, so insightfully and eloquently observed at a gathering at the AJS in December, quote, "In a professional life beset by a whole range of performativities, I will remember Sharon's presence as one that distinguished itself for the particularly capacious way in which she interacted with those performativities, for the ways that she did not capitulate to them, but was able in her sincerity and her actions to graciously neutralize them." Continuing on from the quote from Darcy, "She distinguished herself from the noise, and she brought her friends and interlocutors with her. Sharon listened with extraordinary acuity to ideas, and she always responded with sincerity and indisputable humanity. She did this, I would learn, even when she vehemently disagreed," unquote. So Darcy links this listening, this approach that Sharon brought to her academic life, her intellectual life, to what she calls Sharon's capacity for the, quote, Gillermanian understatement that Darcy describes as deeply thoughtful, uncommonly encouraging, full of forbearance, and a wry relationship to all the trappings of academic life. What I so appreciate about Darcy's formulation is that while talking about Sharon's approach to academia, Darcy frames the Gillermanian understatement in the very terms of academic discourse, as a choice, a move, a school of thought to embrace, rather than something unique to Sharon. In that way, Darcy challenges us to consider where we might find ourselves in relation to the Gillermanian understatement in our own academic practice. In other words, it wasn't just something to admire Sharon for, but a prompt for a different kind of collective imagination, as much as an individual approach. And to whom did Sharon listen? Her colleagues, certainly, her students, absolutely, but also to whomever else she encountered. It wasn't just kindness, though it was kind. It was a thoughtful listening, a smart listening, knowing that it was a means to understanding our own moment and place, while using those observations to come up with new ways of listening to other times and places. I will confess quite readily that I find it a challenge to live up to that model, both in terms of the acknowledgement of the messiness of life, the life of the individual academic, me in this case, and all of the things we juggle and all of the losses and partial successes and doubts and passions we carry with us. That's why I felt it important to begin my contribution today as I did. But it's also hard, especially for me as a literary critic, to feel comfortable moving into zones of everyday life in my research, not knowing what I'll find or if I'll find anything. when I know there is a novel I could much more confidently find to analyze and that I might more readily and easily show my worth and productivity. But I will say my early forays into a different mode, especially into research in disparate archives for the work I'm currently doing on the complex cultures of the Irish suffrage movement, has borne some exciting results. I still use my skills to my historian friends. They actually are skills. Sharon doubted them too, but she was wrong. In reading and unpacking, honed as a scholar of literature and a teacher of literature and cinema. So I'm by no means abandoning what I've cultivated in different contexts. I started to call myself a cultural historian, mainly just at the dinner table and mainly just to annoy Sharon in conversation, because she was very determined to tell me that I was never going to be a historian, because historians are real scholars as opposed to literary scholars who just make things up as we go along. But I've found that approaching things with an eye and an ear to listening that Sharon's scholarly practice inclines, and to analyze objects and practices of living that one is not initially sure will bear fruit, has led me to develop a portrait of Irish suffragism that is far different than what we have been told. So I will end where I began, with thanks to Casden, to the speakers today, to all of you for coming today, and for sustaining Sharon and Maya and me with so much love and thoughtfulness. And I will also end with a suggestion that we find ways to listen to the struggles and successes of everyday living for ourselves and others, as much as a practice of kindness for ourselves, as well as for anyone else, but also as a way of becoming better thinkers, writers, colleagues, parents, family members, neighbors, and so much more. They're not readily separable as much as we might pretend they might be. I would also ask that you do some of that, and it's not easy, not even for Sharon. I was her partner for 19 years, I can assure you. She didn't always fulfill her Gillermanic understatement obligations. But in doing that, rising to that challenge, we do keep alive what was the best of Sharon, her ruach, her Gillermanic understatement, not taking things too seriously because we're taking everything seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And hearing the phrase Gillermanian understatement again really makes me think that you actually have that in the way that you approach academia and life. And it just, I am so sad that I can't share with Sharon the ways that you have been so present in this public mourning process. And I mean, she would have just been amazed at the beautiful statements that you make today and at all of these memorial events. And she was just so lucky to have you in her life for so long. I'd like now to open the chat box up for comments from attendees. There are a lot of colleagues, collaborators, students, friends, relatives of Sharon here today. And I'd like to invite you to put your reflections about Sharon in the chat. And also the memorial page for Sharon that HUC set up is still open. And I'm putting the link in the chat now so that you can also click there and see all the reflections that others have left and leave your own reflections if you haven't yet done so. And as people are working on their reflections in the chat here today, I'd like to open it up to all the panelists. And if there are any things that you are thinking now that you want to respond to from others who spoke today, or just other thoughts that you didn't get in yet, you have a few minutes to do that now. Leah, do you want to say something?
I think it's hard to follow Mark. I think it was what Mark did was sum us all up. You know, this we all gave snapshots of Sharon, but of course, Mark, what you did was reiterate the fact that she holds the story, that she's interested in the story. She wants to hear it. She wants to tell it. She doesn't want to tell it at you, but she wants to elicit from you. And I really value, I mean, every time you speak, I want to echo what Sarah said. But that insight to the way in which there's a way one can become almost melodramatic in memorializing, and yet, you know, we're all honest in the fact that Sharon is exactly who she was, and we love her for that. And I think her legacy is the various pieces. I will tell you that in the student evaluations, there were some negatives, and they happened to do with the amount of reading. I'll just, confess that she was heavy-handed on the reading. But what I liked about that, and I just it's there in the proof text, is that the way that she deftly handled the reading allowed the students to speak their own voices. And that's a real gift.
One of the things I didn't share earlier is that the Show Foundation has an intern program. And basically, Sharon inadvertently was a recruitment, one-woman recruitment department for our intern program, because of course they did her class and then went, I want to know more about that being the Holocaust testimony. I want to go deeper in my experience. And so we'd find that as these interns showed up at the Show Foundation, that many of them had in fact done Sharon's class and had been inspired. And so that kind of influence was like growing deeper in their lives. And I always thought, okay, well, we know that's the case. Of course, you're going to come here after you've done Professor Gillerman's class. It's just part of what we do together.
Well, I'd like to read some of the comments that are in the chat right now. This is a comment from Hillary Shore. Sharon had the gift to make you feel, whenever you saw her, not only that you were, they're moving. Not only that you were the most important person in the world, but that she had just been waiting for a chance to talk to you. She remembered things you'd said years before. She had new ideas. She shared everything. The openness of her heart and the clarity of her mind transformed everything she touched. To think of her still is to smile and feel flooded with the joy of her presence. I cannot remember a meeting with her that was not filled with light. Thank you, Hillary, for that. Samara Hutman says, Mark, Sarah, Paul, Bree, and all the panelists, thank you for the gift of your contemplation on the facets of Sharon that beautifully captured her glorious whole self and makes her durable and extraordinary legacy what it is. And several people are thanking everyone for putting this together. And Michal Lemberger says, thank you for putting this together and inviting us to hear these wonderful and varied memories and tributes. And Ravain Firestone says, a deep thank you to all the panelists for your incredible insights about Sharon, and especially you, Mark. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any comments they want to share at this point on the panel?
Yeah, I would just want to say, as someone who really came to know her much later in life, as I got involved in Jewish studies, what I really appreciated is when I became director of the Casden, I knew very little, and I relied on creating a faculty advisory board to tell me what we should be doing. And what I loved about working with Sharon is simply the fact that Sharon just wanted to get job done. She never cared about credit. She never cared about ego. And I have to say, for all of us who lead busy lives, to have a colleague and a friend who just wants to get the job done and do whatever it takes to get it done, and someone else can take the credit, that is so rare, not just in the academic world, but I think in the world in general. And I will always, always be grateful for Sharon for that.
There's another comment from Micah Gottlieb. Sharon was my friend for over 40 years. There is not a day when I don't think of her and miss her. And Miriam Zamora Cantor says, Bree, you left off how much Sharon deeply respected you as a friend, colleague, and great support. And Chagit Aryalichai says, thank you for meaningful insights and anecdotes about Sharon. Tamara Eskenazi says, thank you for all for bringing Sharon to life and sharing her with the rest of us in such an unforgettable fashion. Gary Bart says, Sharon's insight and perspective inspired me to discover more and to be as open and authentic as her. Tali Zelkowitz says, this is such a moving tribute and memorial to Sharon and how she taught and loved us. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to remember together. I have also laughed out loud several times, which feels like Sharon is here. And Bruce Phillips writes, it's amazing to see how much more there always is to learn about Sharon. And Tamara Zwick says, thank you all. Thank you for all of your thoughts, insights, and memories of Sharon. I feel as if you all just gave us the gift of spending just a little more time with Sharon, whom I miss so very much. And Rivka Dori says, Yehi Zichra Baruch. Jack Quigley says, I love the idea, Gillermanian understatement. It so sums up the experience all of us had with Sharon in family life as a sister-in-law, partner to my brother, mother, aunt, friend, Scrabble player, cook, and friend. Thank you all for doing this. And Mark Schlinkman says, the Gillermanians of St. Louis are so grateful for this program. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Steve Ross to close us out today.
Well, I want to thank Sarah and Leah and Stephen and Josh and Bree and Paul for their heartfelt reflections, and a special thank you to Mark for reflecting on Sharon's relationship to both USC, to HUC, and to her friends and students in such a meaningful and personal way. I also want to thank all of you out in the audience for taking the time on a Sunday afternoon to tune in and join us for listening to this. And personally, it's an honor to present this tribute to the memory of Sharon. And we all at USC and HUC will try to preserve the tapestry of her legacy as we move forward with collaborative events that recognize Sharon's love, not just for Jewish history, but for knowledge, for advancing knowledge, for understanding things, and for having every individual come to their own understanding of how the world works. I want to thank again the panelists, and I want to thank the audience for attending, and I want to wish you all a good and happy evening. Thank you.